Thanks everyone for joining us at the Project Censored radio show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your co-host Eleanor Goldfield along with Mickey Huff, and we're very glad right now to be joined by Mosaab Baba, who is a researcher and analyst on Sudan and has been a lead consultant for the Iron Network. Mosaab, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Eleanor. Pleasure to be on.
Absolutely, it's our pleasure. And I wanted to dive right in here because we've covered on the show before the embarrassing lack of coverage, really, that the entire continent of Africa gets in U.S. corporate media, not to mention individual nations or localized issues. And when they are covered, it's anemically and it just looks like a kind of bizarre snapshot. But even a couple of weeks ago, you had the likes of BBC and CBS covering what happened in El-Fasher, massacres where bloodstains could quite literally be seen from space. And the way that corporate media reports on this, one would think that it was just like some random and extreme act of violence that happened and it'll pass in 24 hours. And so we can just march on with the imperial machine. But this is nothing new. Since 2023, an estimated 150,000 people have been killed, some 12 million displaced. Over 24 million people are facing acute food insecurity, with over 600,000 on the brink of starvation. Cholera outbreaks have infected more than 120,000 people, with more than 3,000 deaths reported. The health system is understandably decimated, with roughly 70% of medical facilities non-operational. So this is really much more than what just one city and one massacre. And I want to get into the UAE and the US and all of that. But first, starting off here, could you talk a little bit, Mosaab, about the so-called rapid support forces that grew out of the atrocities that folks may recall hearing about in the early aughts in Darfur, in the Darfur region of Sudan, a mercenary force that, as the Middle East Eye reported, is pitted against the state which created it, precipitating more than a military conflict, but an existential struggle for the country's survival. So starting off here, can you just kind of bring us into what we're looking at here with regards to who the RSF are and what their objective is?
Yeah, so the RSF are purely kind of a creation of the Bashir regime, which ruled Sudan for 30 years. So from 1989 until he was ousted in 2019. So throughout this period, even back in the 80s and 90s, the Khartoum government was using proxy militias to fight their wars. Those of your audience that are old enough remember the war on South Sudan, in the 90s, it was the kind of the peak of it. And, the government was always arming pastoralist tribes to fight their wars. It was first on South Sudan, recruiting mainly from Kordofan and a little bit from Darfur. But then in 2003, when the Darfur rebellion broke out, the government intensified this way of fighting war and this counterinsurgency tactic by starting to bring in elements that aren't, sedentary. They're not regular pastoralist tribes. They started recruiting a lot of nomadic groups, and this is kind of a historic problem that's never been solved of how do you, modernize communities? How do you change, develop their methods of livelihood? And that's never happened, like neither in Sudan or the whole Sahel region, really, when you think about it, because this phenomenon is, east to west across the Sahara Desert. And this kind of, became, the modus operandi for the Bashir regime. And the genocide in Darfur in the 2000s is kind of what then created a specific kind of counterinsurgency that was more transnational, and that was the biggest problem. Where when the RSF was formed in 2013 officially, it started gaining legitimacy internationally. The Europeans will tell you that they didn't support the RSF directly, but they did support the Khartoum government under Bashir which was using the RSF for quote unquote border control, because the main issue, of course, was migration. You also had things like the Yemen War, in 2014, 15, when it started. Most of the recruits for the ground forces were from the RSF, and the RSF grew very wealthy from that war, supported financially, of course, by the UAE and Saudi Arabia, waged by them, but also supplied by the US and US weapons and, the resulting humanitarian disaster in Yemen as well. The RSF was kind of in there, but all of this was with the supervision, support, and command of SAF, the official army. So there's a tendency right now for people to think as the army has nothing to do with the RSF, and they're trying to fight the RSF, and they've been fighting the RSF. No, this is very recent. The war broke out in 2023 because they couldn't agree on security sector arrangements, which is something that has to happen. It was already agreed upon in the Juba Peace Agreement in 2020, and it became an issue where vying for power internally, especially after Bashir was gone, you know you had the civilian government, which was pretty handicapped, can't really do anything, although they had a lot of support from the US and from the EU and stuff like that, as being kind of the civilian, you know mostly neoliberal kind of political class to run things. But the real power, the economic and the military power and everything still resided with SAF and the RSF. Now, the RSF, the way they differ from SAF is that the RSF recruits mostly on a tribal basis. They started with some of the, nomadic tribes in the West, and then they started expanding on that and really coerced a lot of tribes and a lot of groups to join them. And in some cases, they didn't need coercion because a lot of groups in Darfur would look at it and they would say, okay, either we join the RSF or we get attacked by them, we get violated, and we get, you know what I mean? Like it was a pretty clear thing. And, the rhetoric from SAF didn't help either. So the RSF is really kind of like a counterinsurgency operation that mushroomed into something way bigger and eventually became a nation within a nation. And the main kind of backer of them going back to that period of 2014, 2015 has been the UAE. Saudi Arabia was involved at first, and then they kind of pulled back after they realized kind of what the UAE was after and kind of like how nefarious their tactics are. But yeah, that's the RSF in a nutshell. Ethnic cleansing, genocides, and stuff done by being incubated by the central government in Khartoum for over 20 years. And this war recently, right now, is kind of their way of not giving up power. But there are some other details like the Bashir's political party, and the control they have over the Sudan armed forces is one of the reasons why this war also started, is kind of pushing for it. Because, when you come out of 30-year dictatorship that's based on wars to maintain its survival in a military economy and a militarized government, then like, if the only tool you have is a hammer, then every problem has to look like a nail, The only way they can stay in power is if there's a war, to actually justify the bloated state, the bloated military, all the security apparatus, the national security, all of these, bloated security state apparatus that also monopolize a lot of sectors of the economy. So we're not just talking about professional military and military contracts. We're talking about monopolizing the gold industry, monopolizing, the livestock, moving a lot of the chess pieces when it comes to agricultural land and food security and stuff like that. So it's really kind of SAF and RSF, two empires within Sudan that have been ruling for a really long time, and now they bumped heads because they couldn't agree on how to split the pie And, democratic change and stuff like that is, for them, it's just out of the question. They give lip service to it, but they don't want any kind of, reforming or accountability or transitional justice or any of that stuff. But that's what's becoming right now the only logical way forward to stop this massive crisis that's been happening.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit about you had mentioned gold, and I want to talk a little bit about like the dollars and cents of the situation, because there's always the question of, okay, but what are some of the goals here? And of course, power just in and of itself is a goal, but there's also a lot about Sudan that is lucrative. So, for instance, Sudan was the 16th largest gold producer in the world in 2023, fifth largest in Africa. And El-Fasher is actually close to one of the largest gold deposits in the country. But Sudan also has vital shipping ports, other goods like gum arabic, and millions of hectares of arable land along the Nile. So it seems that there's a lot to salivate over for the likes of Dubai and its golden spires. Could you talk a little bit about that aspect of what's happening?
Yeah. So the Gulf Arab countries have always been kind of looking for that, food security, long term, not even short term. The UAE went a few steps beyond that to not only there for food security, but re-exporting and, manufacturing things. But the main thing with the agricultural land is that, the vast lands in Sudan, little by little, have been carved up by kind of, neoliberal policies of granting huge swaths of land to foreign quote unquote investors, and all of these are cash crops for export. They're using mechanized farming, so it's really not benefiting any of the locals over there. But the lands themselves are huge, as far as the and what you can grow there. You can grow a few things, different kinds of cash crops over there. Livestock is huge, almost neck and neck with agriculture because Sudan, like, all of the pastoralist tribes in Sudan are mostly in the western parts of Sudan, but the number, like, and it's not just the UAE, Egypt as well, depends a lot on the livestock coming from Sudan. So when you add that to the gum arabic, you add that to the huge deposits of gold that are being smuggled, and some of them are being just exported, sold by SAF and the RSF. You're talking about billions upon billions of dollars per year. And these, never go into any national coffers or anything. These are, going directly to support these military efforts. So, when you add other things like you mentioned, like the Red Sea, there's other strategic issues like the Nile waters themselves. That's a huge issue for Egypt, and that's why Egypt has kind of been keeping a very close relationship with SAF. They're the main backers of the Sudan Armed Forces, and because they don't want anything like the GERD dam to kind of overshadow the regional hegemony of Egypt over its direct neighbors. And Egypt has a lot of its economy depends on exports from Sudan, like livestock as well, agricultural products, things like that. So it really is kind of, when you look at Sudan, you see it kind of carved up for these foreign interests, and that's kind of been a central problem for a really long time in Sudan. That's why you saw a lot of protests. You saw kind of the movement to remove al-Bashir as kind of, grievances, as a mix between economic grievances and grievances of war, marginalization, and genocide and stuff like that. So it all culminated in 2019. But that was kept up by SAF and the RSF. These same financial interests, these same economic, exports and, land usage and, these characteristics of an extractive economy are 100% applicable to Sudan.
Yeah, and I wanted to get into specifically what happened just a couple of weeks ago with El-Fasher and how that relates to what we're talking about here, these ongoing the ongoing violence and ongoing problems that have really been rotting Sudan's political landscape for quite some time. Um, and in a word, what happened with El-Fasher is ethnic cleansing, not just through murder, but through rape, torture, forced displacement. Um, and this, what happened a couple of weeks ago, comes after a nearly 2-year siege on the city by the RSF. And could you talk a little bit about the importance of El-Fasher with regards to what's going on politically there? Why would you spend so much time trying to take that city?
Yeah, so I mean, unfortunately, the level of suffering in Darfur is incomparable, compared to the rest of the country. And this goes back to 2003, since the war started over there. And time again, it's the issue of kind of the government choosing ethnic cleansing and genocide over any kind of negotiated political settlement. So when the war started in 2023, it was kind of thought that, okay, the RSF will just fight SAF in Khartoum until they take over, the presidential palace and the military headquarters and like the main military installments, and that's it. But lo and behold, the RSF's, ambitions were more ruling the country and uprooting SAF from there. So they started taking over South Darfur, East Darfur, West Darfur, Central Darfur. When they took over West Darfur, that's when the Guinea massacre happened. So that was the first, within this war, the first large-scale ethnic cleansing happened in a Guinea in West Darfur. And this was in June 2023. So we thought that, okay, a genocide happening and a huge, an ethnic cleansing on a huge level just happened. This must signal the world to move and stop this war. This is insanity. It was almost unbelievable that after all these years, after the Darfur War and after all these peace agreements and everything, that you would still have it. But we tend to forget that the ground forces of the RSF made up, a lot of them are bandits. The ethnic, side to it of ethnic supremacy, over non-Arab groups is huge in the RSF, and it's deeply embedded into society. The same mentality doesn't, exist in central and northern Sudan, but it's not backed by kind of uncontrolled, militia activity. The Darfur civilian has paid the biggest price when it comes to kind of all these wars. So when the war began and the RSF started taking over these regions, it was clear that they were not looking for just like knocking off the government in Khartoum. It was more setting up like a Libya style setup where they, two regions with two governments and two military forces, controlling it. But when it came to Al-Fashir, Al-Fashir was the stronghold of the Sudan Armed Forces and the Darfur Joint Forces. So the Darfur rebels were, created a joint force in the beginning of the war. It started off as a peacekeeping force, saying that we're not picking up arms on behalf of SAF or the RSF. We're not attacking either one of them. Our issue is this war has to stop, and we need to protect the civilians. So it started off as that. But the onslaught from the RSF never stopped, and it kept on expanding. They would recruit locally from different areas, including like the outskirts of Khartoum, on the poorest communities that you can see in these states were recruited by the RSF, appealing to young men, who have no kind of prospects, for work or a career, and then all of a sudden, hey, here's a pickup truck and an AK-47, and, unquestioned authority over, anything that you touch. So it's kind of also a pretty sinister way of moving. But then you started seeing that Al-Fasher was holding out because, they would get airdrops from the Sudan armed forces and stuff. They had armed forces, they had the photo groups. But the persistence of the RSF was really puzzling. Like, you control most of Darfur and you have Al-Fasher surrounded, excuse me, you have Al-Fasher surrounded. What is this insistence on attacking Al-Fasher and taking it over, and a possible ethnic cleansing that's been warned about before this Al-Fasher episode by, like, a year or a year and a half. People have been warning of this, that if the RSF go into Al-Fasher, it's just going to be like a Guinea where there's going to be ethnic cleansing. So, the UAE has a huge propaganda machine and they have some really deep pockets. And I believe they were able to buy the silence of the international community, of politicians in the US and in Europe, to be able to say, like, hey, 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 don't listen to this propaganda. It's just quote unquote the Muslim Brotherhood. They turned it into kind of a boogeyman where there's no smoke without fire. Like, yeah, the NCP, Bashir's political party, is an Islamist party. They've ruled for 30 years. They moved to start this war. They've infiltrated the Sudan armed forces a long time ago, and so a lot of that is true, but that doesn't negate the fact that the RSF is a genocidal militia, and their idea is more internal settler colonialism, which has been going on since the 80s in Darfur. And some of it has to do with Khartoum's push, some of it has to do with like desertification, pastoralist groups having to move further into agricultural lands, complications like that. But Al-Fasher, it was clear as day that if the RSF keeps this up, then hundreds of thousands of civilians are in jeopardy of even being killed, at the least being displaced. So that was kind of, it's kind of like a slow moving comet that we've seeing, and like as much as people have been giving warnings, there was no movement on this whatsoever. But just very mild things like this quad that Marco Rubio is talking about that includes the four countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Egypt. But other than that, nothing serious.
Yeah, and I want to get to the Quad in a second, but before we do that, I want to get into the UAE. You mentioned the propaganda that they were putting out. Um, and indeed how this relates to, collaboration between the US, UAE, and Israel. As I understand it, since the Arab Spring, speaking of propaganda, the UAE has been funding coups, armed militias, and had fueled proxy wars and put out propaganda in order to halt democratic change, essentially like preemptive sabotage, which is reminiscent of US policy in the region. Meanwhile, the UAE is engaged in Israel's scheme to raise Eastern Rafah and erect a concentration camp that would cage some 600,000 Palestinians. The UAE also offered Israel alternate trade routes when Yemeni forces blocked passage through the Red Sea. Israel and the UAE trade in tech, weapons, and of course, genocide. So I was wondering, Mosaab, could you talk a little bit about like the UAE's role in Sudan? Like how did they even get involved in in holding the puppet strings here? And then how does that then relate to the larger genocidal ideologies at play vis-a-vis Israel and the United States?
Right. So one kind of important, milestone for the Bashir regime was in 2014. They cut off their relations with Iran and with, mostly with China and Russia, like, and fully went into the fold of the Gulf Arab countries. And this basically means that Sudan then came under the umbrella of US imperial policy. And these have become the new actors, especially after. I'm glad you mentioned the Arab Spring, because that really was kind of a turning point in the region where these countries that are allied to the U.S. started playing a bigger part and got empowered by the U.S. and of course by Israel to start moving against either nationalists in Arab countries, or theocrats, whatever doesn't fit the neoliberal model for them. And of course, like if you're a monarchy, then all you have to do is talk to the monarch, and that's it. You get all kinds of agendas being pushed. So once this happened, and a very important thing that happened is that, even before 2014, Bashir assisted in removing Gaddafi from Libya, and he even boasted about this. At that time, he was supported through the Qatar, and the Qataris actually like used Bashir to help remove Gaddafi, and of course after that you started seeing all kinds of chaos across the Sahel region. That's where the militias that the AES countries are fighting, the RSF in Sudan, like it all kind of stemmed from that seed of chaos that was sown in 2011 by removing Gaddafi. So then, it was kind of a signal also to these countries that Bashir and his government are open for business when it comes to helping in regime changes and, destabilization efforts, anything that kind of the US, and more importantly, Israel's policy in the region. So Israel really is kind of the compass for US policy in the region. And that's why, fast forward to like 2020, you had the transitional government in Sudan being pressured, to join the Abraham Accords. You fast forward to 2023, and then, Netanyahu puts up a map of the new Middle East that includes Gulf Arab countries, Egypt, and Sudan. So it was very clear that, this started becoming how do they want to mold Sudan into the backyard of the Middle East? You know what I mean? And since then, this is where you started seeing like the UAE step in as kind of the main actor, to buy off politicians, to, supporting the RSF and its ambitions, because it's not new for the UAE. They support Khalifa Haftar, they're supporting separatism in Somaliland and Puntland and Somalia. They just like they've been buying the silence of US and European politicians, they've also worked heavily on the continent. So the UAE, unfortunately, their agenda isn't just Sudan, it is the entire region, the Horn of Africa, East Africa, some Central African countries, and Sudan and North Africa. They're facing a lot of opposition, but they don't really respond to like human rights concerns or anything like that. Again, it's a monarchy, so once the monarch decides that he wants to kind of recolonize Africa using different means, then that's what they did, and that's what they moved ahead with. Other countries are to a lesser extent, but have similar ambitions, like Turkey, for example. Turkey has been a staunch supporter of the Bashir regime. Even right now, a lot of his former party are there in Ankara, and kind of, how Turkey is, like maintaining diplomatic and trade ties with Israel, but giving lip service like this can't continue. So it's also like one of those regional imperial countries. And this is what's new right now in this period is that, we like the idea of the multipolar world, but, there's an asterisk with it, meaning that some of these poles might have some imperial ambitions as well. And that's kind of what's been happening with the UAE as well.
Yeah, good point. I mean, what good is a multipolar world if you're just breaking up the power structure to perpetuate genocide and imperialism? And I mean, what you're describing sounds like a Berlin Conference redux, like how, the Berlin Conference being when a bunch of Europeans just met to break up Africa, and they randomly and arbitrarily drew lines to create what we now understand as the nation states of Africa. I mean, it sounds like this is kind of the same thing, but like in a new version. And now we get to do it with people from the Arab world, so it's okay. It's kind of like the diversity of imperialism, as we saw with Obama and a lot of people in Biden's cabinet. And I wanted to wrap up here because you recently wrote a piece in Black Agenda Report where you talk about the so-called Quad, and that would be the U.S., UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt doing so-called peace talks. Although the phrase peace talks doesn't seem like it fits in any of these any of these four countries' purview of something they'd understand. So, could you talk about what's going on with these supposed peace talks? And I mean, the idea that UAE could have a place at this table when it's so clearly perpetuating the war crimes is, I mean, I suppose it's not very shocking given our current situation in the world, but it's absolutely ludicrous. So, what is the situation right now with this Quad and the supposed peace talks?
I mean, this is basically the handlers, getting together and how to, control the handled, and this is basically them realizing that nobody's going to ignore the atrocities anymore. There was very sporadic reports and attention to Sudan, up until the El-Fasher episode. And like I said earlier, this is, the UAE has a huge lobby in the US, and they're kind of them along with the Zionist lobby kind of riding shotgun are able to pretty much silence any politician. The how big the crisis is kind of resulted in these countries having to move. Because the thing is, like, if they continue to ignore it, even after Al-Fashir and the whole world is looking at it, then it's not just an issue of kind of voting constituents or anything like that. I mean, this is a genocide, and I think they had to move out of pressure, out of public opinion pressure, out of media pressure. All of the NGOs that are working and reporting on Sudan, all of the humanitarian UN agencies are telling them like what is going on. This is like a post-apocalyptic world that's happening in Sudan right now, and nothing is happening. And both of these forces are allied to you. That's the main problem is that, when you follow the money and the guns on the RSF side, it's clearly the UAE. When you follow it on SAF side, the main perpetrator is Egypt. Egypt has played a very coercive, kind of negative, you know, role in Sudan, reminiscent of the colonial period, and they've coerced kind of to cement Burhan and military rule in Sudan. Like that was one of their main priorities since 2019 is to make sure that no civilian government that wants to make decisions for themselves regarding Ethiopia, regarding the Nile waters, regarding their trade, relationship, regarding the Halaib Triangle that has tons of gold in it. The Egypt doesn't want a democratic government that's gonna, make some decisions other than decisions friendly to it. So they actually did coerce it. I don't believe that they actually wanted this war to get to this point, but they definitely wanted SAF to crush the RSF and rule Sudan for, indefinitely. So these countries are, you know, directly supporting the warring parties that have caused this chaos. So this is kind of their mess through and through. The US has put in a lot of effort to bring Sudan into that fold and to make it like a loyal satellite, up to the point of pressuring it to do austerity measures and to lift subsidies and so, you know what I mean? Like the whole package that comes along with it. The war on terror. It was a lot of ex-Syrian fighters ended up in Sudan mysteriously. Ex-ISIS and Al-Qaeda fighters were ended up in Sudan, reportedly as a, deprogramming program or like a moderation program or whatever. But that's the thing. Like this quad is, focused on their forces, and they know that at this point they don't have the credibility to say, here's a peace process for Sudan that involves, civilians and political parties and a political process and all of that stuff. The Quad, I don't think has the ability or the acceptance in Sudan anymore to weigh in on any political process going forward. The way the coup that happened in 2021 when they removed Prime Minister Hamdok and SAF and RSF took over the country completely. This was approved by the UAE and by Israel and by these people. And I was there in Sudan at the time. Like as soon as that coup happened and kind of they killed that December movement that removed Bashir, the streets flooded even more than 2019. Huge, massive protests, in all parts of Khartoum and different cities in Sudan as well. But that was kind of the sentiment that if you take us down this route of military rule in a diverse country like Sudan, where outside of SAF and RSF, you have more than 100 other armed groups that are some of them are involved in the political process and some aren't involved. So it's kind of like, people recognize that this cycle is going to lead to war, a military coup, and then but all of this was done in lockstep with kind of, regional U.S. policy, on Sudan. So that's why they understand that this is their mess and that the 12 million people being displaced, which is an astronomically high number when you're talking about, war statistics and casualties and stuff like that. And that 15,000, like 150,000, I guarantee it's close to 500,000 as far as the death toll. But, there's no proper numbers. There's not a lot of organizations working in Sudan. So yeah, that's kind of, why the Quad, can't ignore it anymore. It's not by their choice. It's just by like the sheer magnitude of the crisis itself.
And I mean, we don't have much time yet, like just a minute or two, but just real quick, what do you expect to come from these quad meetings?
The fact that they're still going on right now, for maybe about 10 days now, is a positive sign, at least that there will be like a humanitarian pause, a ceasefire, something like that. I mean, we don't know for a fact, but it's just, the level of carnage that's happened in Sudan would require it to at least for that to be the outcome of it. And we're starting to see a different tone right now. Like, what Rubio said yesterday about, the RSF and it not being, it's not abiding by the ceasefire and it's continuing to commit atrocities. And, we'll have to apply more pressure if more than that. I mean, that's kind of a scary thought, of course, like, the US intervening in any way in this kind of war. But I don't think he means any kind of military intervention or anything like that. But just calling out the RSF, and he didn't call out the UAE, of course, but he did call out the RSF. But it was pretty much a signal to the UAE. And I think also pressuring the Sudan armed forces to negotiate, because that's been one of the main things is that Burhan has not been willing to negotiate at all and really riding the narrative that the RSF is a foreign invasion and we're defending our homeland and everything, which is also like has a seed of truth, but like, that's not why his, Bashir loyal SAF soldiers actually started the war. It's they understand that losing power comes with any kind of agreement. So, there's a lot of pressure on him not to negotiate, from his officers and stuff like that. So that's also another part of it is they want to pressure Burhan into actually, negotiating and ceasefire or a humanitarian pause. But the bigger and more important process, well, not more important, but it's the necessary process, is the kind of comprehensive dialogue that the African Union is putting together. Because like SAF and RSF couldn't fight without their constituencies. So their political, their tribal, their regional constituencies, their political representation has to be there in the room in order to, kind of quell the war and then start talking about accountability and transitional justice and, transitional period in general and how to like, work on constitution and there's a lot of stuff that has to do with kind of nation building after all this carnage and all the years of the Bashir regime and everything, that needs to be done comprehensively. And the African Union is not the perfect platform, but it's the only platform available for this kind of dialogue. So that's an important thing. There have been things like the BRICS countries moving to quell the regional conflict. So basically adding Ethiopia and Egypt in 2023, but also adding the UAE and Iran together into the BRICS. So nothing is materialized out of that, but at least once there's kind of some kind of end to the war, the next step would then be more of a question of how are the what how are countries interacting with each other. Sudan doesn't have a place over there, but at least the bumping of heads and the proxy wars that are going on right now would come to a halt, hopefully, in the future.
Yeah, I mean, with everything that you've just mentioned, it reminded me of a quote from a Syrian refugee who said, "Everyone may be lying, but the war is real." So the trick is to
Yeah.
try to dig through the lies to find the truth, and also to find a path towards justice. Mosaab, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us and contextualizing this important information, and really doing the work that corporate media doesn't care to do, and lying through as they lie through omission. Folks, do check out the Ayin Network. That's AYIN. And also, I was pulling from here an article that Mosaab wrote on the Black Agenda Report, and you can check that out at blackagendareport.com. Mosaab, thank you again for taking the time to sit down with us.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. Take care.